This is a 46 of 46 podcast campfire story. Couchsacraga, an Algonquin name meaning dismal wilderness, a name aptly given by the Algonquin tribe to describe the Adirondacks as a whole, though maybe even more appropriately given to the mountain which bears this name. An isolated peak, sitting deep in the High Peaks wilderness. This infamous peak often leaves a bad taste in the mouths of those who climb it. Whether they're disappointed with the minimal summit views, the swamps that surround it, or something else. Perhaps this mountain has more to it than meets the eye. Maybe there's a vengeance it seeks against those who visit this desolate wilderness. And it may be the shortest high peak in the Adirondack Park, but it's a mountain notorious for inexplainable things happening to those who dare ascend it. Whether you're on a quest to become a 46er or you're just looking for a trail less traveled, anyone who dares wander these woods will find themselves crossing the swamps that lay at its base. Known to most as the Couchsacraga Bog. But beware, something changes in that dismal wilderness once the sun goes down. And if you're brave enough to visit this peak, just make sure you're back across the bog before nightfall. Because once the darkness arrives, so does something else. Up in the trees, hiding, waiting for night. Soaring through the sky after the sun goes down. A lesson that Andy and Sara would learn the hard way about this remote peak. They'd soon find out what goes bump in the night at the Couchsacraga Bog. It was a late September weekend, and Andy and Sara were packing up their green Subaru Forester for a weekend of hiking in the Adirondacks. This was the weekend they'd been waiting for. Not only was it going to be a beautiful, sunny fall weekend on the trail, but they were about to become Adirondack 46ers. The culmination of a 3-year journey. Sitting at 43 of 46, they had one more range to hike. A remote range. One that often gets pushed to the end for good reason. The Santanonis. Panther, Couchsacraga, and Santanoni. They were driving up to the Adirondacks from Boston, where they both work as civil engineers. This drive is one they've made many times over the last few years, so they had their routine down. And being detailed-oriented people, as most engineers are, they went through their checklist meticulously. Backpacks? Check. Boots? Check. Poles? Check. Headlamps? Check. Spare batteries? No, but I put fresh batteries in our headlamps this morning, Andy told Sara as he closed the back door of his Subaru. It was time to hit the road, and they began their drive from Boston up to the Adirondacks, west to Albany, and directly north on 87 up to the ADK. It was a Friday morning, and they took the day off of work since this was going to be a weekend worth enjoying. They planned to arrive at the Santanoni trailhead in the afternoon, then hike into the Bradley Pond lean-to and set up camp for the celebratory weekend. This way they could enjoy Friday, have all day Saturday to hike, and then hike out Sunday morning before driving home. It was the perfect way to finish the journey they started 3 years earlier. But then again, this is the Adirondacks, and these mountains don't care about your plans. As they drove north, they passed the big brown sign which Sara always takes a picture of. Now entering the Adirondack Park, a 6 million acre state park. That sign never gets old, Sara said with a big smile, hardly being able to contain her excitement about becoming a 46er this weekend. They turned off exit 26 and soon arrived at the Santanoni Range trailhead on Upper Works Road just after 3 p.m. As Sara finished gathering her gear, doing her final check, she saw a crack of light leaking through her side backpack pocket. Her headlamp was accidentally left on in her backpack, and it's been on the whole trip. And neither of them had spare batteries, but since these were brand new this morning, Andy casually replied, We'll be fine. We're not going to hike in the dark anyways." They swung their packs over their shoulders, locked the car, and the adventure was underway. They signed in for the weekend and started the initial 1.8-mile trek down the dirt road before turning right into the woods onto the Bradley Pond Trail. And the lean-to was another 2.5 miles away from here as they hiked deep into the Santanoni wilderness. The sun was shining, the leaves were colorful, and the woods were filled with birds. A great start to their weekend in the backcountry. Sara walked in front with Andy directly behind as the couple crunched their way down the mostly leaf-covered autumn trail. Just as they approached the Santanoni Express trail split, a solo hiker came rushing down the trail, almost as if someone was chasing him. Sara said hello, but the lone hiker seemed oddly shaken up and didn't say a word. He just moved right past them as fast as he could and said nothing. "Nice guy," Sara sarcastically said to Andy. "Yeah, and I can't believe he's out here without any gear, not even a backpack," Andy replied as they gave each other a confused look, but they turned right at the junction and began moving away from the Santanoni Brook towards Bradley Pond, half a mile away. The sun was starting to go down as the golden magic hour light vibrantly shone through the orange and yellow leaves on the trees, making the hardwood forest look like a postcard. The days were shorter this time of year than they were a month ago, something Andy and Sara both innocently forgot to take into consideration when they planned their weekend's trip. And it was very unlike either of them to overlook this sort of detail. The two picked up their pace in an effort to arrive at the lean-to before dark, thus allowing them to maintain whatever battery life was left in Sara's headlamp. And soon they came out to the Bradley Pond on their left and the Panther Brook Trail junction, where they'd start the next day. So they continued straight and moments later arrived at the lean-to, where there was a single sleeping bag and pillow set up in the far corner. No problem. Plenty of space to share, Andy said to Sara as they both began setting up camp for the weekend. As the couple laid out their sleeping bags on the old, slightly broken wooden floor, suddenly 2 crows flew into the lean-to and just stood there, silently staring at them. Andy shooed them away with his trekking pole, and then they quickly flew off. "Damn crows," he said as he prepared to build a small campfire after collecting logs and bark. The familiar scent of the campfire filled the lean-to as they prepped their packs for the next day's adventure. The smoke rose into the clear, star-filled Adirondack sky above them. It was shaping up to be a great weekend in the woods. The sounds of the forest were lively that night, and specifically, the crickets. The evening was winding down, but still no sign of the lone camper staying in the lean-to. Despite not wanting to go to sleep before this mystery hiker returned, they decided it was time to get some sleep, since it was after midnight now and a big day on the trail awaited them. Just as they both zipped up their sleeping bags, the gentle sounds of the woods around them, they heard a huge splash down at the pond. Must be a beaver, they thought. And then at that point, Sara looked out the lean-to and nearly jumped out of her skin, startled by the sight of 2 crows once again standing at the front of the lean-to, silently staring at them. They never even heard them fly in. Once again, Andy grabbed his pole and shooed them off, and then the crows flew away into the darkness as the campers laid back into their sleeping bags, sprawled out across the hard, bare, wooden lean-to floor. Suddenly a chill filled the air, and the wind started to gust with no remorse, leaves blowing everywhere inside the lean-to and out. There was no rain coming or no severe weather in the forecast. It was a clear night. And yet the mountain was unexpectedly alive as the trees relentlessly blew all around the forest in an instant. And suddenly the woods were filled with the sounds of dozens of crows cawing mercilessly in the distance. It sounded like a war zone. Andy and Sara laid silently in the lean-to, listening to whatever was happening deep in the wilderness. The heavy wind and cawing lasted only a minute, however, before it came to an instant halt, ending as quickly and abruptly as it began. Now the woods went quiet, still, and the cold chill in the night air was gone. Unknowing what just happened in the woods, there was nothing they could do but to stay put in the lean-to and hope it was over. Andy and Sara slept a little closer to one another that night as they nervously dozed off to sleep. The sunrise came at 6:52 a.m. and so did the beautiful sounds of chirping birds. But still no sign of the unknown camper. He never came back. They didn't wake up until around 8:30 a.m., and then they stood from their sleeping bags as the morning sun shined into the lean-to. Once again, there were two crows standing at the front of the lean-to, watching them. Startled and slightly fed up now, Sara yelled at them as they flew off. The sun was shining, and today was the day the two would become Adirondack 46ers. They took their time getting ready for the day since they weren't in a rush, knowing they'd be camping there again tonight. And due to the slow morning and not setting any sort of alarm clock, they ended up getting a much later start than anticipated. Over 3 hours later. They eventually suited up, day packs on, poles in hand, and walked back towards the Panther Brook Junction to start the hike. The plan was to hike up the Panther Brook Trail to Summit Panther first, where they'd eat lunch since they heard it was the best summit of the day. Then they'd hike over to Times Square and down to Couchsacraga, then back up to Times Square and finally end the day on Santanoni, where they'd become Adirondack 46ers. A textbook plan for the day. But once again, these mountains don't care about you or your plans, and especially not this mountain. They hiked up the Panther Brook Trail, and upon coming to the top of the brook, they decided to refill their water bottles before moving forward, since this was the last place to pump water for the day. Well, unless you want to drink the swampy water of the bog, of course. After pumping, it wasn't long before Andy and Sara came out to the Panther P Rock, where they turned right and finished the quarter-of-a-mile trip to the Panther Mountain summit. And as they left the tree line and approached the summit, they couldn't help but notice the sound of crows above them. And then as they stepped out onto the rocky summit ledge, two crows were flying overhead, circling the summit repeatedly, almost as if they were watching the two hikers. They both found it odd as they'd never seen so many crows on any of their hikes. Everywhere they went. And once arriving at the summit, they dropped their packs and ate lunch. After all, this was the final hike to 46, so they were in no rush and they wanted to enjoy every second of it. 44 or 46. They were close. While sitting on Panther, they had clear front-row views to the next peak of the day, Couchsacraga, sitting below to the west. A slightly secluded peak, almost as if it was abandoned by everything around it. Then to the left, looking south, they could see Santanoni. There it is, number 46, Andy excitedly said to Sara.
"Hello, Santanoni!"
he yelled out from the summit as the echo bounced off the wilderness below. Then suddenly a cold breeze flew in, followed by a huge gust of wind out of nowhere, so powerful it knocked both of their backpacks over and blew Andy's hat clean off his head over the cliff. Then once the wind calmed down, leaving as quickly as it arrived, the temperature rose back up and the chill was gone. Andy walked over to the ledge to look for his hat that blew off, and upon looking over the ledge, just off the cliff, there were two crows once again standing on the ledge below, directly in front of his hat. And he looked at them for a minute before one of the crows grabbed his hat in its beak and flew away. "Hey! Hey! What is with these damn crows?" Andy said to Sara as they both watched the birds fly out of sight with Andy's hat back into the tree line. Plenty of daylight left, yet plenty of hiking still to do, especially considering how long the out and back to Couchsacraga takes. So it was time for them to get moving. They left the summit and quickly hiked down to the giant boulder at Times Square, an infamous coal and trail junction for all three peaks of the Santanoni Range. This marked the start of the unmaintained trail over to Couchsacraga. They took a few photos at Times Square, a place they'd read all about, and began the mile-and-a-half trip to Couch. The two weren't anticipating the difficulty involved with getting down the 800 feet of elevation loss over the mile to the coal, so they hiked down slowly, yet steadily, and then they were there. They were at the bog, a large, swampy coal filled with down logs, crisscrossing in every direction, deep, mucky water and mud, a unique area that looked like a tornado had run through it. Andy and Sara scoured the terrain as they contemplated their path across. There was no obvious way. And this area felt different, however. There was something off about it. It was big and desolate, and there was no way to confirm